Now we have to make a difference between what is public corruption, which I just described, and lots of other dishonest behaviors. Because societies and human nature is, prone to some degree of inclination for cheating. We are all very selfish, and it's absolutely natural that we want to get a little bit more than what we invested, right? But social life presumes that we are able to control one another, so this doesn't happen. So there are a variety of cheating or dishonest behaviors out there, but not all this should be named corrupt, because there is not an equal sign between corruption and dishonesty. There are varieties of other crimes which involve fraudulent behavior and cheating beyond corruption. Now, what makes corruption particular is simply this abuse of entrusted power in order to get the undue profit. But there are lots of other dishonest behavior, like, stealing, frauding, defrauding some public document, right? Conspiration to cheat, which is called collusion between private parties, right? And all kind of other manipulations to get more than their due. If they do not involve authority, we have a name for each of them, but we do not call them corruption. Now, traditionally, the definitions of corruption were a little bit of three kinds, but in fact, they're not all describing the same type of corruption. And I think, the best classification in literature is of an American political scientist called Arnold Heidenheimer. And he described all the literature on corruption, which tried to describe this phenomenon in three ways. First, you can have public office-centered definitions of corruption. So for somebody to be corrupt, he has to be a corrupt official. He has to have this official authority which he can abuse or use discretionarily, resulting in some favor versus discrimination. And then this is corruption. Then there are definitions which are public interest center. In other words, you don't necessarily have to be an official, but in one way or another, you are a beneficiary of trust. And therefore, each time when trust is breached and the public interest is breached itself, you can describe corruption. It's probably the easiest example to understand this is, for instance, a referee in a soccer game. A referee in a soccer game doesn't have an official position, but on the other hand, a lot of public trust is entrusted to him, and it's in everybody's public interest that the result of the soccer game is fair. Think very clearly and materially that besides the fact that people only watch sports because it's a merit-based competition and you want the best to win, but beyond this, there are people who bet in sports, in results of sports. And therefore, a lot of people are going to be cheated and public interest is going to be infringed if the referee of a soccer game is corrupt. And he just dictates, in favor of the team who pays him a bribe. And this is a public interest center definition. Now, more clearly, the oldest, very comprehensive definition of corruption comes from the American political scientist Joseph Nye in 1967, who also introduced a very clear distinction that we still observe. He basically said that a corrupt behavior is behavior which deviates from the formal duties of a public role. In other words, the referee plays a public role without being a public official because of private regarding, by this understanding, either personal or close family or some sort of private clique related to the person who's corrupt, pecuniary, money, or status gain. I can promise somebody that I will give them an award or a decoration or prestige or something, which trespasses public-private separation in order to gain a profit. Now, the important notion that he introduces here is of private-public separation. In modern government and in modern society, we presume that there is a separation between your duties as a public official and your private patrimony. In other words, the car that is given by your office to fulfill your office, right, is not yours to do your personal job, right? The money which is entrusted to you as the budget of your government agency is not yours. Even if you, plan to return it, you should not be able to take a loan out of this money to fulfill some sort of private need. There has to be, and it has been, starting with 19th century in most advanced countries, a very sharp distinction between what is public and what is private, coming with a code of conduct of what is appropriate to do and what is not appropriate to do. This, of course, didn't exist 1,000 years before when, for instance, European kings paid for wars out of their public purse, because simply historically the public-private separation was not born, and there was no distinction between the king's money and the government's money. This separation between the budgets, between the royal household private budget, as for instance the Queen of England has today, and the public budget, the budget of the country, occurs relatively late. And before that, it's rather difficult to discuss public-private separation because not such thing existed. Today, however, it is quite very sharp and enshrined in the legislation and constitution and administrative codes of many, many countries. The simplest definition that we go by, used by Transparency International and a lot of organizations, was summarized therefore by Susan Rhodes Ackerman as individual corruption, which is abuse of public office for undue private economic gain. And as you notice, it is this distinction between public and private and the presumption of their separation as the normal state of things, how things should be, the benchmark which still dominates this definition of corruption. Now, what is the market-centered definition of corruption? Well, this is not an alternative definition of corruption, but simply refers to a type of corruption that we observe quite frequently, again, particularly in developing societies. And this is an economic situation in which, in fact, corruption helps solving an economic problem. Let me give you an example that you might know well, which is health. We have this extraordinary correlation between corrupt countries and very poor public investment in health. For some reason or another, corrupt governments pay very little for health, allocate little money for health in their budgets. And therefore, what happens is that the personnel who works in health, doctors and nurses, they tend to be severely underpaid. So underpaid that in fact they should not be able to fulfill their functions. And in order for nevertheless the health system to work, what happens is that patients pay directly. More often than not, this is not what should happen, because either constitutionally or by some law, these patients already pay for health. There is probably somewhere on their payroll some sort of health contribution to a state insurance or to the budget of the health, only that is very small. Either it's very small, so even if putting it up altogether it's not enough for health, or simply the government, who's a corrupt government, diverts the money for other purposes, and very little arrives there in the way of payment for doctors, payment for nurses, or payment for medicines that somebody needs in the hospital. Therefore, simply what happens is that patients pay in order to equate supply and demand. And this is basically a way of governments of extracting from patients like an extra tax for health. And corruption in this situation, which for instance scholars like me do not even call corruption, is basically a form of policy failure. People have to pay directly for a service which is nominally and constitutionally should be free. And what is important about this definition is that there is no way that classic anti-corruption, repressive anti-corruption, just arresting doctors will solve this kind of corruption. You will simply have to solve all the policy problems which underpin this particular deviation of behavior. Unless you do that, there is no way that your health system is going to work.